A lot of people feel like giving their baby formula comes with this negative side. I want to help to put your mind at ease. And so I've brought Mallory from The Formula Mom on Instagram here to talk today about the top 3 myths when it comes to formula. So today we are busting formula myths. So Mallory, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for you have such a fabulous way of talking about these decisions when it comes to formula and just busting these myths that people feel so guilty about formula. So thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure. You know that one of my very favorite things is helping families feel confident and feel supported and feel educated about formula feeding. And so I always appreciate the opportunity to come on and just share a little bit about what I think parents need to know about formula feeding.
For sure. And so for a lot of people in my community, it is either kind of falls into a couple different spots. Either their plan is to breastfeed and breastfeeding didn't look like what they thought it was going to. And so they've transitioned to formula, or maybe they're preparing to adopt and they're not planning to induce lactation. And with that, so often people have these questions that are like, I feel horrible about this. So can you just kind of speak to that and the guilt that people feel?
Absolutely. That's really the biggest thing that I tackle in my Instagram page and in my community. And I think a lot of people don't realize how prevalent formula feeding is. So according to the CDC data, about 83% of families initiate breastfeeding at the hospital. By 6 months, 75% of families have introduced formula. By a year, that gets up to 86%. And so you have these folks that feel really isolated and they feel like they're the only ones who are formula feeding, either because breastfeeding didn't work or because, they used a surrogate or they're adopting or whatever reason. When in reality, the great majority of people are formula feeding eventually, more often than not by 6 months, some even by 3 months, some exclusively from the beginning. And so that's really one of my favorite things about my work is helping people realize, number one, they're not alone. Number two, there's not one right way to be a good parent. And number three, the majority of the parents that you interact with are making the exact same choices as you, and you just don't realize it because people don't talk about it. So making formula more visible in terms of, conversations about it as a safe, healthy, valid choice, that's sort of my bread and butter.
Yeah. And I think it also is kind of what people talk about when it comes to social media. People think that everyone's lives look like one thing. And the reality is people are doing different things than you think. And so kind of just coming to terms with you're doing what's best for your family and your situation. And that looks different for everybody. And I have families who are like, okay, I'm breastfeeding, but I think I want to introduce formula. And it's almost like they're afraid to ask this question. It's like, no, okay, find your balance. And I always say that like, as soon as, if mom goes down, this whole team's out. Like you need to feel good about what your decision is.
Absolutely. The very best thing you can give to any baby is a happy, healthy, emotionally available parent. And if the pressure to breastfeed is making you not that, then it's costing too much.
Right. For sure. For sure. So you are going to bust myths for us today. So I know you have 3 myths you're busting. What is myth number 1?
Yeah. So myth number 1, and we'll go through them piece by piece, but myth number 1 is that formula fed babies are more likely to be obese. And going through these myths, because these are the sort of questions I get in my DMs all the time from women who are exhausted by trying to maintain some sort of breastfeeding or pumping relationship, or they know that it's not right for them, or they're scared that if they formula feed, they're going to doom their baby for life. So we're going to go through these so that the folks in your community can feel comfortable and confident knowing that formula is a safe, healthy choice. So this first one, there's a myth out there that formula fed babies are going to be obese. And the big thing that we have to know about all formula research is that it is not high quality, random control trial research. And so that's really the type of research that we want for a really high quality research study is random control, where you assign one group to an intervention and the other to a placebo effectively. We can't do that with breastfeeding because we can't force half of the women to breastfeed and half of the women to formula feed. It's not ethical. And so because of this, what we see are that studies rely on people who have opted into breastfeeding and who have opted into formula feeding. And when you are looking at folks who have opted in, you're always going to get other factors that led to why that person opted in or out. Things like education level, things like socioeconomic status, things like culture and race and support system, all of these things. Okay. So we think about obesity specifically. What we find is that babies who were fed formula do have a higher body mass index later in life, but that the formula itself is not causative. So folks who tend to choose formula also tend to choose lifestyle choices that may lead to obesity. And the reason why we know this is because we can look at sibling comparison studies where one baby in the family was breastfed, another was formula fed. And when they're both adults, there is no statistically significant difference in obesity rate. And so that tells us that it's not the formula, it's other parental lifestyle choices, whether that's activity level, genetics, the food that they're feeding in adolescence, access to healthcare, all of that. So that's really my favorite thing are those sibling studies where we can see there's no real difference here. It's not the formula or the breast milk, it's the other factors within the family.
Right. And just more proof that it doesn't stop and start at formula. Like you're making this food choice for your baby right now. Absolutely. And you will continue to make food choices for your children for years and years, and just kind of understanding that. So it's not the formula, it's those choices later in life as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So what is myth number 2?
Myth number 2 is that formula fed babies have a lower IQ. And this one is really damaging, right? No one wants to feel like, oh my gosh, if I give my baby formula, they're not going to be as smart as they could have been otherwise. And
right. So, or if I stop pumping, or if I stop doing this, like, look at what I'm doing to my child. Like now they don't want to get into the college they want to. Like,
yes, of course, that's going to make parents concerned. So what I like to direct parents to in this particular instance is that the largest study, it was called the PROBIT, PROBIT, the largest study that's been done about breastfeeding outcomes did not control for maternal IQ. So that means that they looked at these babies' IQs who were breastfed and who were formula fed, and they found that breastfed babies have a higher verbal IQ score by a couple of points, nothing super significant.
Okay.
But they didn't look at what the mother's IQ score was for either group. Once they controlled for those factors, so they basically said, okay, the mothers in the breastfeeding group tend to have higher IQs. The mothers in the formula feeding group tend to have lower IQs. They found that the IQ scores of the babies were correlated to their mother's IQ scores, not to what they ate or drank as an infant. And so again, it just goes back to this idea that there's no way to control for the reasons why someone may opt in or opt out of breastfeeding. And so the data that you get as a result is inherently biased.
Okay. Good to know, because that's something that it's like one of the first things you hear as you're deciding whether breastfeeding is the right choice.
Oh, absolutely.
So what is myth number 3?
Myth number 3 is that babies who are formula fed are sicker more often or have allergies or asthma or any of these things. And there are 2 big pieces that I like to tell parents to make them aware of with regard to this issue. Number 1 is that you have to look at total risk. So a lot of the times you'll see fear-mongering tactics, scare tactics that'll say things like, babies who are formula fed are twice as likely to get an ear infection. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's terrible, twice as likely. But what they don't tell you is that you've effectively increased your risk from 2% to 4%. So yes, your risk has doubled.
Right.
The overall risk that your baby's going to get an ear infection is still, 90.
Right. If we take 100 babies, you went from 1 of 2 to 1 of 4. And that's
right. Exactly. And so you have to, a lot of these fear-mongering statistics rely on that relative risk. Oh, you're twice as likely, without giving the context of what's the overall risk. Your baby is still 96% likely to not get an ear infection no matter how you feed.
Right.
Same for sort of all of those sickly related, gastrointestinal issues or upper respiratory or whatever else. Even if we find that it increases the risk, it increases the risk incredibly slightly on the whole, and not meaningfully in terms of, what would be important for a particular family. I was reading a book, it was called Lactivism by Courtney Jung. Very, very interesting book. And it said that to prevent one ear infection,
Okay.
12 mothers would have to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months, which is about, I think, I can't do the math off my head. It was like 20,000 hours of breastfeeding. So in the grand scheme of things, is 20 hours of women's time worth preventing one ear infection?
Right. And I think this is so important, because people will look at things and say, like, this is the benefits of breastfeeding, and this is what I believe to be true about formula feeding. And what's important is that you are making the decision that's right for your family, as we talked about in the beginning. And without that stress weighing on you, it is hard to be a new mom. You are adjusting to this new life. You're getting less sleep than you're used to. Your relationship with your partner has completely changed. And now on top of that, you have this weight of this decision where you feel like you just made your kid like dumb and obese and sick, and now you feel awful. And so I think it's important to understand that, to take these things into consideration. And you do such a great job of explaining it. And I know I'm going to link below to your Instagram, where you have tons of info. And the number one question that I get about formula, and I always lead them to you, is how do I know which formula is best? And like that. So you have a free formula guide that we'll link below. And then you have different resources as well. So we'll send all formula questions in your direction. And we just appreciate your time so much, just to help clarify all that's out there. And I really just appreciate your time. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks.